morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night to wherever you are, whoever you are. Welcome to Life Mastery TV, your source for inspiration, empowerment, and fulfillment. My name is David McLeod. I am your Life Mastery coach and author of the book, A Life to Die For. And I'm really excited to be here again because I just love bringing wisdom and truth and support for you to live a better life. That's what this is really all about. So I'm so glad you're here today, whether you're live on the presentation or whether you're watching this recording. I'm just glad you're here. Today, we are talking about a really, I think, a challenging topic for a lot of people. It's called Surviving Sexual Trauma. This is episode 156, if you can believe it. And let me just say that sexual abuse is a problem. I mean, a serious problem in our world today. Far more common, I think, than people tend to believe. And it's only because of things like the Me Too movement and what's happening now with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell that we're starting to see some of this stuff come to light. And we're starting to see the degree of challenge that we have all over the world. I mean, with child and sex trafficking, I mean, it's really getting bad. And obviously, we don't necessarily want to talk about how we can stop that process, although we certainly want to raise awareness about it. What we do want to do is help people to heal if they've had any challenges with this kind of sexual abuse or sexual trauma or whatever it might be. So for this episode, I have invited a sexual abuse recovery coach and an author of the book, Beyond Surviving, the Final Stage in Recovery from Sexual Abuse. Now, she has had a lot of training, a lot of background, and she is running a coaching company called Rachel Grant Coaching. Oops, I gave away her name too soon. And so she's a sexual abuse recovery coach, and she's got a master's of administration in counseling psychology. I'm sorry, a master of arts in counseling psychology. Anyway, I want to just thank you so much. Rachel, thank you so much for being here and welcome to today's show.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. It's so nice to be here with you. Thanks for the opportunity to come and have a conversation.
Oh, you're most welcome. And so what folks don't know is that you and I met at an event. I guess it was probably, must be 4 years ago now.
14, 15, yeah, something like that.
Something
yeah.
like that. Called The Big Shift. And I remember that you were one of the coaches who was supporting Bill Barron in that program. And I remember I had some stuff going on around an issue with one of my children. And I remember just talking to you about this and finding you to be so open and loving and a really powerful healing presence for me personally. And I really remembered that's stuck in my mind for a long time, and I've been reaching out, and I wanted to get you on this show because I know that what you share with people is really, really important. So I'm not going to make this about me. I want to make this about you as much as possible and your business. Can you maybe start us off by sharing with us a little bit of what your journey was like that brought you into this path of being a sexual abuse recovery coach?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I too remember that moment together with you, and just so appreciated your transparency and the heart that you had, for your child. And I think ultimately, when we know that there is suffering in the world, we want there to be healing around that. And our own suffering often informs and influences the paths that we take and the journey that we go on. And so I came by way, into doing this work in kind of a wiggly way. I didn't necessarily set out with an intention of becoming a sexual abuse recovery coach. In fact, it didn't even exist when I did start. So I kind of made it all up, but based on other training in neuroscience and my master's in counseling psychology. And, where I am today in my life is so unfathomable in many ways. Like if I were to go back and talk to my teen self or my 20-year-old self and say, this is what your life is going to look like, I wouldn't have believed it. Because at those times in my life, I was really still suffering very much as a result of the sexual abuse that I experienced. So just to share with you all a little bit more about my journey and my story. I grew up in Oklahoma. I'm a Midwest girl, love gravy, love hanging out on the front porch. And my grandfather came to live with our family when I was 5 years old. And David, I was actually really excited about that because my mom and dad were older when they had me. And then my sister and my brother, therefore, were also older. They were 9 and 10 years older. So in many ways, I was like an only child.
Mm-hmm.
And when my grandfather came to live with us, I felt like I had a captive audience in him. I would run home from school and I would go straight to his room and we would talk and hang out. We spent a lot of time on the front porch together. And so he became really much a friend and a companion to me during those years. Around the age of 10, we were sitting out on that front porch swing one day, and I always liked to cuddle up, real close. I was a cuddly kid. I was affectionate. And he reached around and he began to touch my breast. And I remember thinking that he just didn't realize what he was doing. Like it was just, a misplaced hand. And so I started to wiggle, but he gripped a hold of me, and wouldn't let me move. And in that moment, I dissociated. I didn't know that's what I was doing then. Of course, I only can look back at it with hindsight and understand that that's what my brain was doing, in response to the fear and the confusion of that moment. And eventually I did kind of come back to myself, and I jumped up and I ran to my parents' bedroom, and I was crying and I was upset and I was confused. I'm 10 years old. I have no real connection or understanding about sex or sexuality. I have only a basic understanding about body safety. These weren't really topics that we had talked about in my
No,
family
of
or
course
in
not.
school. There was not like today. I mean, I'm so excited to see how much has evolved and how many parents are today really tackling this topic with their children. Um, and so the abuse continued for some time, and it, got worse, until one day my mom happened to be walking by, and saw him touching me. And she, ran out onto the porch and snatched me away. And my mom and dad got him out of the house pretty quickly. Um, I'm very thankful for that. I've been, working with people who've experienced sexual trauma for 13 years now. And so I hear a lot of stories where, parents denied, minimized, pretended nothing
Sure.
was happening,
Yep.
turned a
Mhm.
blind eye. So I always have to mention that part because, it's a way of honoring my parents because they really did a wonderful thing there to protect me and stand up, for me.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, him being out of the house is good, right? This is a good thing. But just because his physical presence was gone, oof, like all the impact was not. I was still feeling all of the things: confusion, I'm bad, I must have caused
Right.
this,
Right.
lots of, fears and anxieties. And, my nervous system, again, I didn't know that at that time,
Sure.
but what I can see
Mhm.
now is like my nervous system was really dysregulated. And so I was having really big emotional swings. And, my parents got me into counseling. I managed to go to like maybe 1 or 2 sessions, but ultimately I was just in that place where so many survivors are at a point in their journey of, I don't want to talk about this. I just want to pretend that everything is okay. Let's all just
Mhm.
move on here, right? Nothing to see. It's all good. And so I really shut down and did my very best to try to push it all away. And then that's really the state that I was in all the way up until about the age of 18. Now, even though I was trying to pretend that everything was okay, I mean, it wasn't,
Sure. Sure.
right? My teen years were a mess.
Mhm.
I was struggling. I had lots of beautiful moments and lots of wonderful things during those years too, but I was really insecure, and I was confused about sex. I was confused about relationships, had a lot of anger that I didn't know how to
Right.
channel or what to do with. So if we jump forward to, my first year in college, that's really when I started to get the courage to look at what had happened. And so I started doing a bit more reading and counseling, and basically the stage where you begin learning. Like once you've gotten out of that pretending stage and you begin to acknowledge, hey, this happened, then you begin learning. It's the stage that I often call becoming book smart about trauma. You're just gobbling up everything that you possibly can to try to make sense of it all and try to put the pieces together. Oh, this is why I do that. Oh, that's why I struggle with this.
Mm.
And so I was doing that work, and I was also in a relationship at the time that was abusive, unfortunately. So it was this kind of strange time in my life where I was doing healing work around childhood trauma, but also being traumatized in the present day. And then when that relationship ended in 2006, that was really the biggest turning point for me. And I just remember sitting in my new apartment and struggling, like really fearful about my future. Like where do I go from here? Because everything that's been happening up to this point has been really heavy and really scary. And I can't keep going this way. And I just remember having a really clear thought in that moment, David, of like, okay, like I've got to get my shit together, like right now, or I'm going to spend the rest of my life feeling pretty miserable.
Right.
And just surviving. And that ultimately is what launched me, right? I just became obsessed with like trying to answer this question. How do we actually heal sexual trauma? How do we heal that injury? And so I did my master's in counseling psychology. I began to study neuroscience, and I really just started using myself as a guinea pig to say, okay, does this work? What, I have this problem, I have this issue, I have this area where I struggle, and what is actually going to help me and support me? And that eventually evolved into what is today the Beyond Surviving program and the work that I do with my clients.
Well, that's quite a journey. And thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I know that having done some of my own personal growth work, going back and looking at old trauma and old pain can bring up current feelings. So I want to just honor and bless you for that.
Thank you.
And at the same time, I remember I had an episode of sexual abuse when I was 9 years old. That it was just a one-time thing. It happened when I was at summer camp, and it's not a huge deal because, well, maybe it is a huge deal. Maybe it's something that I need to do some work on. I mean, I haven't actually thought about it in that way, but I understand from my own personal experience. I never wanted to talk about that with anybody.
Yeah.
I was only 9. I knew that there was something wrong with this whole situation. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, although my hand was involved in the event. But you know what I'm saying. It was something where I knew something was wrong. I could not articulate it because I didn't have the language. I hadn't learned enough about, sexuality and all that stuff to be able to explain it.
Yeah.
I've gone and done some work on it now. So I understand that resistance that young kids particularly would probably have. And what I'm wondering is, how can we empower those kids to speak up so that they know that what's actually happening to them is wrong, and that they have every right to say no and to call for help and to get someone to stop this?
Yeah.
It seems like that is a problem that we really have in our world, that so many kids are just afraid to speak up.
Right. Well, we're working against a couple of things here. So first of all, children are very socialized to always listen to the adults in their lives. Yeah. And the adults are right, and they have the final say. And in many ways, that's true and real and important, right? Because the adults do have more life experience. But in the context of trauma, this is something that somebody who is going to be abusing a child manipulates that. Right, takes advantage of that, that innocence, that trust, that naivety, and so, the most important thing is that we're having open conversations with our children. These conversations need to start from the time they are, they have language. And teaching them how to say no, teaching them about their bodies, teaching them about consent, and continuing that conversation. With my parents, who I'm working with around their own sexual trauma, but they often have those concerns, right? Like, how do I minimize the risk of this happening to my child. And I always tell them this needs to become like a dinner table conversation. So just like, hey, how was your day at school today? What did you learn? How was baseball practice? Whatever. Okay, anything happened today that, is concerned? Anything, bringing it into just normalizing the conversation so that they know that they can bring things forward to you. And it also means giving your child agency, which is sometimes hard for parents, getting out of their way and letting them have that agency so that if they're speaking up about other things in their lives, that can translate to speak up, when something like this happens, and continuing to build the conversation as they age and making it more and more age appropriate, getting into more of the nitty gritty as they get out, into the world of, dating or become, an age where they might become sexually active, these sorts of things. So it's tricky because it really calls on the adults in a child's life to get past their own hangups about sex, their own fears about having these conversations. Oh, aren't I planting a seed and, creating fear and all of that. And there are some great people out there like Anya Maines, who does really beautiful work around very directly with parents about how to talk about sex. And so, seek out the resources. If you don't have it, just kind of in your own toolkit and feel comfortable with it, get comfortable. Yeah, go out and learn, because it's only through really giving children that voice and teaching them about these things that they're going to then have an opportunity to bring it forward if it's happening to them.
Sure. It's interesting you mentioned this idea of planting a seed, and I can see where, that is concerning to me, because I know it's possible to put an idea into a child's head that this kind of behavior is bad. And the child may then decide, I really don't like this guy. So what if I make up a story of this in order to get him out of my life? This is another problem that we have to deal with, because kids learn to manipulate at a young age too. They start very young. They learn to manipulate us right from the moment they're born. And some of us are very willing to be manipulated by our kids. We think it's cute. Oh, look at this little guy. He's just growing up into such an amazing person. We kind of talk about this as being precocious or we come up with various other words that we use to describe this behavior and to make it okay. Where do we draw the line? We got to be really, really careful here. And I mean, as a coach, one of the things that I do is I try really hard not to plant any seeds ever, to make suggestions to my clients at all. I try to tell them to come from within, to look for the answers inside. So what is really true in this moment for you? Rather than suggesting, well, maybe what you mean is X, because when I say X, suddenly that's a thought that's planted in their head, and that could become real for them. So I have to be very, very careful as a coach. And I think as parents, we have to be very, very careful about how we speak to our kids too. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would just say that research bears out that it's very, very rare for, that first of all, a child has to have the language and the description. So, the details in order to bring a case forward. And so without those details, it's going to probably fall apart. Sometimes with those details, it falls apart anyway, because our justice system is so whack when it comes to this particular area. But I would say that the likelihood, it's such a small percentage that of children who use that. It's usually a parent that manipulates a child. That's what we actually see. That the parents are going through a divorce or something's happening, and the one of the parents starts to, well, didn't he do that, or didn't she do this, and manipulates the child to then manufacture stories about the other parent. Right. But children just out of the blue kind of using this as a way to manipulate is not really statistically, doesn't really statistically bear out.
Okay, that's fair. And I know that it's probably a very unlikely scenario, but nevertheless, I still feel that it's my responsibility to be careful what I give my kid in terms of I'm planting the seed. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
I want to be very careful with that. In fact, I try to be careful with that with everybody.
Sure. I mean, it's as simple as saying this is a serious thing. This isn't a game. Like you can, use that sort of language and that sort of framing to reiterate to the child, like this is the context and this is why it matters. And but it's also just like you wouldn't make up a story about, a friend stealing something, I mean, there's all, you put it all in the same category.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we have to teach them how to be truthful and honest, but also not to be afraid to speak up.
Yeah.
That's really what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So now you shared a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced long after this experience had passed. And I know that this is something that pretty much everybody will face at one point or another. Perhaps you take on the belief that you're not good enough, or that you deserve this kind of treatment, or that maybe you caused it, or a whole series of stories that people make up about themselves, and that can have a real negative impact on how you show up in other areas of your life. So how do we deal with that? I mean, let's first of all talk a little bit about the kinds of things that people are likely to experience, and then we can talk about what they can do to overcome those things.
Sure. Well, so when we're talking about the context of childhood sexual abuse, what we want to keep in mind is that the child in this circumstance, in this experience, is trying to make sense of the experience. We all want to understand why. With everything, we are like why machines, and that's just the way that the brain works. It's looking for associations, it's looking for cause and effect, so that it can basically, the number one thing the brain is in charge of is keeping us alive, is survival. And so understanding cause and effect, when I touch this hot pan, it burns. Okay, I'm now going to learn not to touch the hot pan, right? When it's the context of sexual trauma, where it's a confusing state, because it's with somebody who is most of the time trusted. 90+% of sexual trauma in childhood occurs within the family, or with somebody who is known and trusted, so not strangers. And so there's the complexity of this dual experience of, this is somebody who I love, this is somebody who does do really lovely, wonderful things for me, and is also harming me. And so this is the first challenge that the child is faced with, is trying to reconcile that. And because we are dependent upon the adults in our lives, we cannot make them the bad guy. It's not psychologically sound for a child to do that, because the number one thing that the child has to do is continue to belong in the family system. That's where we get our food. That's where we get our shelter. That's where we get our protection. It's really historically, like, it's a really deeply rooted biological need. If we think back about like tribal, times, if you're cast out of the tribe, you get pushed to the edge, you get eaten by the tiger, right?
Right.
And so holding on to a sense of belonging is critical for a child's psychological health and well-being. So they therefore try to begin to explain why the thing that is happening, but are drawing only from what they have in their experience, which is very limited and is going to be very egocentric. And so this is why most survivors of abuse will have frameworks like, this was my fault. There's something about me that caused this. There's something that I did or that I didn't do that caused this. There's something about what I needed that caused this. And so all of that, like just that one piece of the puzzle of, I caused something really bad to happen.
Right. Yeah, that all makes perfect sense. Now, let me ask you this. This is probably a sensitive topic. I'm not asking you personally for your experience, but in general, how often, when a child is in the process of being abused, how often do they actually maybe even experience some pleasure in the process?
Most of the time, because sexual touch.
So that even adds more to the confusion.
100%, right? And so your body, and then, so this vessel, right, this thing that you're living in and breathing in all day long starts to become an enemy, right? My body is doing something, I don't really like it, I don't really want it to do, or I'm confused about how it's responding. This body of mine might be the reason why, I'm even attracting, particularly women will have beliefs that like it's because I was a girl. It all gets wrapped up in their sex and their gender identity and femininity. And so just being a woman starts to be painful.
Right.
So, and a source of trauma. Yeah. And so all of this, now that's not even to touch on what's just happening neurologically,
Right.
physiologically
Mhm.
with trauma. So when you're being traumatized, your brain is going into activation. Something negative is happening here. A threat is on the scene. How am I going to survive this? And so the brain, starts to change as a result of repeat trauma. The hippocampus is highly impacted, which is our like memory, plays a big role in memory. And so this is why trauma memories are often dissociated, like there are gaps, there are pieces missing, things aren't necessarily in chronological order, which then until people really understand that that was their brain doing what the brain is supposed to do, leads to a lot of doubt. What if I'm making this up? What if none of this is
Sure.
real? Well, and then that's like a whole other, challenge and mountain to climb for people. So all of that dysregulation leads to all sorts of things like insomnia, chronic illness, hypervigilance, high anxiety, can be the other side of the coin, like depression, withdrawal, isolation. And so, we become, I sometimes say, the main problem with trauma is that it doesn't end when the trauma ends. It's really everything that comes afterwards that is where we almost like pick up the baton, because all of the impact and the effect is what we're continuing to deal with and work with in many ways. We're not actually working on the trauma. We're working on everything that we came to believe as a result of the trauma.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I just wanted to address the people who are on the live presentation right now. If you folks have questions or comments that you'd like to share, please feel free to just type them into the chat area. We'll be happy to answer your questions or honor your comments, whatever. This is really meant to be a healing session to the maximum extent possible. So, I honor you if you choose not to speak or not to say anything, and that's perfectly okay. But feel free to do so. Your comments and questions are most welcome. So thank you for that, Rachel. You were talking about some of the science here and brain impact and the neuroscience and all that stuff. Can you maybe go into a little bit more so we understand physiologically some of the damage that can happen?
Yeah, for sure. So when the brain, so when we're experiencing a threat, when we're in the actual moment of being traumatized, the brain is basically trying to react and respond to this threat. And so the amygdala, this part of your brain that is like the control center for reactivity, becomes activated. And what's fascinating about the amygdala is that it has thousands of channels in which to send its information out to the brain and the body in order to get us into reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening, though, is when the amygdala is flooding the system, there are other parts of the brain that don't get to function as well. It's like their capacity to function diminishes. And so that's the prefrontal cortex, which is where we, do further data processing and rational thought. This is why it's really hard to problem solve when we're activated, when we're upset, or even when
Sure.
we're in the middle of an experience, like trying to figure out what to do and how to respond. The hippocampus, as I mentioned, is diminished, and so are the data that we're collecting. We're collecting implicit memory, but maybe not explicit memory, and so we might only have little bits and pieces of detail. But all of the implicit memory, like how we were feeling and the fear and the trauma, all of that is still being coded. And so these neuronal pathways, are being established. These associations are being created.
Hmm.
And your system is taking in, it's really sensory based, right? So the sights, the sounds, the smells, the textures, these sorts of things. And all of that gets coded kind of under the label of danger, bad. We're all, and
Wow.
then later in our life, we're walking down the street and maybe we pass by someone who's wearing, a cologne that smells similar to the cologne that an abuser
Sure.
wore. And the brain picks up that sensory data, the scent of it, starts to process it through. So it goes in through the thalamus first. And the thalamus says, "Ooh, this seems like it's associated with something that was bad, dangerous, wrong in the past." So then it sets off the alarm to the amygdala. And then it basically just starts this whole cascading effect of reactivity. And for
Wow.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
And for so many survivors of trauma, they don't understand that process. They haven't been given that knowledge and that information. And so, for me, like I just walked through the world feeling like I was crazy, right? Like, what's wrong with me? Why does any little thing just cause me to fall apart or get super angry or feel afraid all of a sudden? And so once I began to understand that my brain had, there are other places, right? Like the corpus callosum, this is the part of the brain that like handles emotional regulation. There's the cerebellar vermis, sorry, is the part that handles emotional regulation. Risk taking, all of that is impacted. But the good news, David, is that the brain is so pliable that we experience an injury to the brain and to the nervous system, but that injury can be repaired. We can build new neuronal pathways. We can eradicate old triggers. And so that's really the basis of my work, is teaching people how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it does sound complicated for sure. And I wasn't quite expecting such a neural lesson in biology and anatomy, but thank you for that, because it's important. We don't necessarily all need to know the specifics of which part of the brain does what. But I understand that having that information can really help to really get a better picture of what's really going on. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like, all right, I drive a car. I don't need to know all the parts names for all the engine components. But if I do know them, the more I know about my engine, the better care I can take of it.
Yeah, totally.
So, it's an option that I have available to me. And the same thing is true for my brain or for any other part of my body for that matter. If I
Yeah, very
want,
much
I can
so.
really get into depth and learn more about it. Well, thank you for sharing that. That was really, really important.
Mhm.
And so
Okay.
now I guess you suggested that there are ways of eradicating these old triggers and healing these old wounds and maybe fixing pathways in the brain and
Mhm.
all that. Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm imagining, a lot of the work that I do has to do with the same thing, although I'm not necessarily doing it in the same way that you do it. But I'd like to hear your mechanisms and what kind of approach you use.
Yeah. So, in the Beyond Surviving program, I teach something like 50 different skills over the course of the 8 months, because coming at it from lots of different angles is important, using different entry points. So, some of the skills are somatic, some of the skills are cognitive behavioral, some are, family system, mindfulness. But the main thing, like if the most basic thing to understand is that our system can either escalate or regulate. And what we want is healthy nervous system regulation. We want to be at like, this is our best. This is our even self. This is our grounded self. And the things that take us out of that can be quite varied. And so the goals and the intentions are to, first of all, understand what to do when you begin to escalate so that you can regulate. And these interventions can be actually very, very simple. It can be as simple as starting to ask yourself questions. So you're starting to get activated. You're starting to feel like, something has triggered you. Maybe you know what it is. Maybe you don't know what it is. But rather than just continuing the escalation ride, and getting more and more upset or getting more and more activated, understanding how to interrupt that process. So it can be as simple as asking yourself a question like, what did I have for breakfast today? Where's the last place that I went on vacation? Any question that you don't maybe necessarily know the immediate answer to. So not like, what's your name? Because that's a very ingrained,
Right.
repeatable thing. Yeah. And just that little moment of distraction and interruption, it gives your prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, time to override the limbic system, which is where the activation is happening.
Sure. Okay.
And so that moment of like break helps that intervention slide in and calm the system back down.
So what you're basically doing is kind of refocusing your attention on something that will help you to just kind of, instead of escalating, to help you regulate more. Is that really what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
And there are so many ways that we can do that. And that's, in the Beyond Surviving program, that's the very first piece of work that we do. It's all about the boot camp for the brain, helping people understand what are triggers, what's actually happening in the brain, how to control and manage the system, how to intercede and interrupt activation. From that foundation, we then can get into the other healing work. Like one of the things that I experienced in my own journey and that I saw happening over and over again for people is they go into therapy or they go into a setting and environment to get support, and they're immediately asked to talk about their story. Tell me all the details, break it all down. And that actually tends to be more re-traumatizing for people.
Sure. Yeah.
Because you're asking them to speak about the trauma without them having any skills for regulating or even how they're holding that story. So once we have the basis, the foundation in place, then we can work with shame, then we can work with connection, then we can work with the emotions, then we can work with reframing the story. And then on the other side of that, we can really get into the other heart of what I really am doing in Beyond Surviving, which is helping people grow up. Like I had a really clear moment in my life, David, where I was like on the floor kicking and screaming, like literally throwing a temper tantrum like a 2-year-old would. And I was 25, right? And I was a little bit out of body where I could kind of see what I was doing and thinking, God, like I have the emotional maturity of a 10-year-old. My capacity to communicate, to respond to my feelings, to be in relationship. And so one of the things that I love the most about the work that I get to do is really helping people learn these skills. Like, what does it even mean to trust? How do you set boundaries? How do you work with your anger, your anxiety, or your fear? What does it even mean to have intimacy? Reclaiming sexuality is a huge piece of this puzzle. So the nervous system regulation and kind of those brain boosting strategies are really key, because they set the foundation for us then to do the other work, which really ultimately helps us mature into ourselves so that we can live an empowered life. And that's the name of the game here. Like for me, I am so up against, the idea that's out there that trauma is a life sentence, that you're just going to have to deal with this and it's just how it is. And there isn't anything that's going to change about that. But that's absolutely a myth. We are not, we are not destined to suffer for the rest of our lives. That's why I talk about the final stage of recovery, right? Not the final stage of learning things about yourself or growing or discovering, but we should not be spending our entire life in recovery where we're having to always be looking at and dealing with and processing the past trauma that happened.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's so there's something I wanted to just say real quick here.
Yeah.
When you talked about having this experience at 25, I think you said, of having a temper tantrum and having this awareness that maybe you had at that moment, you realized you had the emotional maturity of a 10-year-old. And I want to remind people that this happens, I believe it happens to all of us, not necessarily because we've been sexually abused, but because of different things in our lives.
Totally.
And I want you to, first of all, love yourself and understand you're not doing anything wrong. That's the first and most important thing I want people to know. Just by honoring yourself and allowing yourself to have that experience of a temper tantrum when you were 25 years old was probably one of the best healing moments you've had in your life, because it released some energy that may have been stored in there for the longest time, and it gave you an awareness that up to that point you maybe didn't have.
Sure.
And I know, and so it's really, really important for us as human beings to recognize that we're all at different levels. Some of us have certain parts of our growth and development cut short for various different reasons, and we may not realize it for the longest time. And I know in my case, it took me 40 years of gradually increasing anger and resentment before I realized I had to do something. 40 years.
Yeah.
So,
Totally.
you know, I think of, all right, my own journey was challenging enough and painful enough for me to deal with. So I want to just honor everybody. Whatever pain you have, it is your pain. It's different. It's not better. It's not worse. It's just different.
Yeah.
And whatever you get in terms of learning, once you heal that pain, that's really where the gift is.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think this is something that's so important to reiterate, is that, as a result of trauma, we often feel bad about ourselves. We feel like we are worthless. We feel like we're not good enough. And then that carries over into the healing journey. Oh, I'm not doing this good enough, or I
That's
struggle
right.
with that.
That's right.
Therefore, there's
You
something wrong
judge
with me.
yourself for judging yourself.
Yes, totally. Yeah. So cultivating that capacity for self-compassion, for grace and kindness. We're so good at, I think, what I know about my people in my tribe is that they have big, big hearts, and they often, are very loving and very compassionate and kind and supportive to other people, but they don't know yet. They have to learn how to turn that around for themselves, right? How to give that to themselves.
That is, that's a very, very good point, and something that I've been teaching people for a long time. You're right. On the outside, it appears like we're real good at having compassion for others. And yet we're not quite as good at that when it comes to having compassion for ourselves. What's ironic about that is once we learn how to have deep self-compassion, we then discover that maybe we weren't as compassionate for others as we thought we were. And we realize we have all this much more compassion and love to share just because we have focused some on ourselves. It's really, really important. And so I'm glad you brought that up.
Nice. Yeah.
So I guess you mentioned about believing that I'm not good enough, or I'm not doing this right, or whatever. Those thoughts can really mess us up. What kind of answers and support do you have for people as they get caught up in those kinds of thinking patterns?
Yeah. Well, we have to understand the origin. Most people hear that voice as their own voice and hear it as a truth. And so a huge piece of the work that I do with my clients is about helping them understand the origin of that belief. Where did that actually start? Where did that actually come from? What is the experience that you had? So, for example, when the first time my grandfather, abused me, that I recall very specifically, I ran to my parents' bedroom and I was crying and I was upset, as I mentioned. But the other piece of that story is I remember sitting there thinking, why isn't anyone checking on me? Like, I'm upset. My mom and dad are supposed to come help me when I'm upset. Where are they? Why aren't they coming? And again, my 10-year-old mind, in answer to that question, comes up with, I must not matter to them. They don't care about me. I guess I'm going to have to handle this all on my own. And so we can look at experiences and start to understand, oh, when that happened, I came to believe that this was true. And then I began living as if it was true. I began integrating more and more the idea that I don't matter. I really lived from the place of I'm all on my own. So I kept people away and I would do everything by myself. I wouldn't ask for support. And so then we have to go back to those moments. That's one way, is to go back to the moment and say, well, wait a second. What are some other reasons why people didn't come and check on me? And challenge it. Challenge that initial thought. Don't take it for granted as 100% true. Look at what else was going on. Look at what other people, what other choices were being made. Like, for example, like maybe they didn't come check on me because they couldn't hear me. Like, they literally could not hear me. Maybe I thought I was crying really loudly, but I wasn't. Maybe they'd all been abducted by aliens. They weren't even there to come and help me. Like, it doesn't even necessarily have to be rational, but it's just about the brain becomes so like, okay, this is it. That
Right.
is the thing.
Yeah.
And so we have to kind of wiggle out of it a little bit and say, no, actually, it could have been this, it could have been this, it could have been this, it could have been this. And if it could have been all of these other things, then what that means about the story that I made up is that it's not 100% true. And once we have that wiggle room, there's the possibility that what is true is that I do matter and that I can ask for support. And then that gives us a jumping off place to then try to take risks and try to challenge it and explore and do things a little bit differently. And as we do that, like the brain is confused for a while because it's been very much trained. It's on autopilot. So when I'm having experiences out of my life, it just wants to go automatically to that same old thought. And as we're building the new neuronal pathway, the brain is like, wait, which one am I going to? I'm not sure. But as we keep accessing the new thought, and as we keep accessing more evidence and activating that, the old thought gets pruned away, the old associations get pruned away, and the new thought becomes the dominant. Yeah. And so I guess where I want to lead with that is just to say the process is actually very straightforward. It really just requires repetition. And I think that's one of the hardest things that I felt in my process and my journey, because it gets tiring, David. It just gets tiring.
Sure.
It's like, yep, I got to come back to it again. Yep, I've got to come back to it again. But eventually, when the scale tips, it's like, whoa, okay, now there's no effort here. Now there isn't any more work. And so having support, having encouragement, having resources, places where you can check in is really critical, because we cannot heal in isolation. Like there's no way we can do this on our own, because we are going to have those days where we feel like we're right back at square one, that we just don't want to, these sorts of things. So it does take some fortitude. But the good news is that in time, things can really shift and change, and you can take back your life. I mean, ultimately, that's what I want for the people that I'm working with. Like,
Right.
I don't want you sacrificing the rest of your life because of the
Exactly.
choices that these people made. Yeah.
Right. Well, you've talked about a lot of important stuff in here, and the one thing that was coming up for me, you said, when this happened, I decided this. And I think that's a very, very important and crucial observation, because this is something that we do, whether we do it consciously or not. We are constantly making choices.
Yeah.
And the more we can raise our awareness about the choices, the more we can understand why we're choosing one thing over another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then it makes it easier for us to take responsibility for our choices.
Yeah.
And ultimately, every choice we make, whether we do it consciously or not, is our responsibility. So I think what you're doing in that process is you're teaching people to say, all right, you made this choice, just take responsibility for it, and now recognize that maybe you can make a new choice.
Right.
You don't have to be stuck with that choice. You made that choice in the moment based on the information you had available to you at the time. Correct. And it was probably the only choice that seemed relevant. Correct. Good for you for making that choice. It may have kept you safe. It may have saved your life.
Yeah, totally.
So I bless you and honor you for that choice. Now the question is that choice still working for you today? Yeah. Is that belief still working for you today?
It's huge. So much of what I had to own up to in my own healing was that I was living in a kind of hands up in the air. Life is just happening to me. There isn't anything I can do about it. And I had to put my hands back on the steering wheel. I said, no, this is my life. This is my ride. Right. Yeah. And so I have to become the author. I have to take agency over my life, and I have to learn, right? Those tools, all the tools and skills that I'm teaching, that's essentially what we're doing. It's like, okay, how do you have agency over setting boundaries? How do you have authorship over how you react when you're feeling angry, right? And so that owning piece, own your life, take responsibility. Don't take responsibility for the shit that isn't yours. That's the problem. That's 99% of the problem, is that people get stuck in taking responsibility for the stuff that isn't theirs and suffering as a result of it. Mm-hmm. Whereas what they need to do is let go release the shame of that, release the responsibility of that, but take ownership of your life right now, here in the present.
Right.
And the important thing is there has to be some structure underneath that to support you in it, because it's not a just, well, let me just think that and that will happen. No, there's a process to
Sure.
get there, but that's the overall process. Like that's the big picture of what all the little steps are adding up to.
Right. Well, and you mentioned this again before, and now you've kind of looped around it one more time, and that's this whole notion of repetition.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I like to think of it in this way. I remember when I was probably 13 years old, everybody in my age group wanted to smoke. Everybody thought it was cool to smoke. So naturally, I wanted to smoke too, because I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be one of the gang. When I think back to how much effort it took me to become a smoker, it was awful the first little while. I hated the cigarettes. I hated the smoke. I hated my body, rejected it, everything. I went through this process where I had to repeatedly push my body to do something that my body didn't want to do. Basically, I abused myself in this process. And what happened was, after a while, my body finally said, okay, if you're serious, you really want to do it, then go for it.
Yeah.
Now, this is what happened at the start. I repeated something over and over and over and over and over again until it became second nature.
Yeah.
Then 30 years later, or however many years later it was, I'm realizing this is not healthy. I gotta stop smoking. Well, guess what I had to do? You talk about repetition.
Woo.
I had to do repetition in the reverse direction to undo what I had done.
Yeah.
And so it's no surprise to me that it's like any belief system. Any belief system we have is just a thought that we had over and over and over again until it became repetitive.
Yep. Yep.
So if we want to change it, we have to question it, decide that it's no longer a belief that we want, and we have to work and repetitively change it, because it's going to keep coming back. Yeah.
Yeah. There's this great video called the backwards brain bicycle, and they took a bicycle and they configured the wheel so that when you turn left, the front wheel would actually turn right.
Oh God.
And when you turn right, the wheel would turn left, right?
Oh,
and so you watch people like getting on, if you've ridden a bicycle and you have the muscle memory of like how it works, you just get on and you want to go and do it just the way that it's always been done.
Over. Right.
And so you see people just struggling and they fall over and they fall over and they fall over again and again and again. But for the people who like kept practicing with it, they switched it. Yeah. And then when they were given a quote unquote regular bike, right? Then they couldn't ride that bike. The one that they knew how to ride, they couldn't ride anymore.
Right. But here's something else. And I want to add to this, because it's a great analogy. Your brain is so good that you can train yourself to ride both bikes.
Yes. Yeah. And so we want to find like exactly what I was just saying earlier, like which ride do you want to go on?
Exactly.
Like you honestly at this stage, I'm only talking about at this stage as adults who have agency and choice about their lives and about their thoughts and about their attitudes, these sorts of things, that you are actively choosing which ride you want to be on at a certain point. Now, I say that with tons of compassion because I know sometimes it feels like, no, Rachel, like it just takes me, my brain just goes there and that automatic reaction response. And so that is true, that there are some things that happen that are outside of our conscious control, but then we can create consciousness around it, right? We might be having, like I was saying earlier, you might start to feel activated and have no idea why, but you can recognize I'm activated. You can develop a capacity to have that awareness. And if I'm activated, even if I have no clue why I am, what am I going to do about that in that moment? Yeah. And so
you're going to ask yourself, what did I have for breakfast?
Yes. Do that. So, that's it. And it's really about building out your toolkit, having access to lots of different resources, because sometimes one tool will help in one moment and then it won't in the next. And so you access something different. And then, of course, the overall intention is that we live our lives more often than not in this place of healthy nervous system regulation. Esther Perel calls it our optimized self. I love that. I've really adopted that as a framework. And that when we're not in our optimized self, can we see it? Can we recognize it? Can we not shame or blame ourselves in it, about it? But then can we take care of ourselves to bring ourselves back to this place of optimization?
Right. Well, obviously, probably the biggest and most powerful tool that we can bring to bear here is self-compassion, self-forgiveness, and self-love.
Yeah.
If we can bring ourselves into those places, and even if it means imagining a higher self on the outside that's bringing all that love to us,
Mm,
like a little child, imagine yourself as a little child just being wrapped up in love
yeah.
from this external being. Even if that's the only way you can do it, it is a great way to start the healing process.
Yeah.
And to keep it going.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you talked earlier about you've got something like 50 tools in your Beyond Survival program. Is there one tool in particular, aside from the quick question in the moment, that you can offer people today as we begin to wrap up?
Yeah, I'll give you a somatic tool that's really fun. So when you're feeling frustrated, angry, upset, activated, however, whatever term you call that, maybe having a flashback, yawn,
Yawn.
yawn, fake a yawn.
How do you
And
fake a yawn?
and what's amazing is as you start to fake a yawn, you yawn.
Yeah, right.
Because the way that the brain works, it's like and it's that whole thing, right? Like when you see someone else yawning, you start to yawn.
Sure.
But when you yawn, it basically shuts down all activation. It is one of the best interrupters. Yeah.
I'm gonna remember that one and try it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a good one.
that sounds like a good idea.
Right on.
Yawn.
Yes. Awesome. Thanks, David. Wow, it's been so nice to be here chatting with you today. Boy, we covered a lot of territory, didn't we?
Yeah, and yeah, it has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your spending the time with us. Is there anything else that you'd like to share before I wrap it up?
Well, I just want to reiterate for anybody listening who's experienced sexual trauma that, I know the challenges, I know the journey. And for some of you, you're in the earlier stages of your work. And so some of what I've been talking about doesn't even necessarily apply. But if you're a little bit further along and you're really at that place of like, okay, enough is enough. I understand. I've talked about, I've done, all of the research and reading and learning, and now I really want to understand what to do about it. Then I really encourage you to come connect with me over at rachelgrantcoaching.com. You can download the 3 stages of healing checklist at rachelgrantcoaching.com/checklist. And that's going to help you better assess where you are in the journey and also make sure you understand what resources and tools are going to be most helpful for you based on where you are in that journey.
Right. So that's Rachel Grant Coaching. That's Rachel, Rachel, Grant, Grant, coaching, coaching.com.
Mm-hmm.
Go check out that website. You can find out more about Rachel and connect with her, send her email, whatever. And hopefully you'll be able to resolve any issues that you have. And again, that's what we're here for with your Life Mastery program. The idea is to help people become masters of their lives and just to build their capabilities and mastery of all kinds of skills. So I want to thank you all for watching today's program. And remember, you can watch this recording and recordings of all other Life Mastery TV programs at my website at lifemasterytv.com. That's life-mastery-tv.com. I truly hope you enjoyed this presentation. In a couple of hours, you're probably going to receive an email from the Learn It Live organization offering you a chance to give some feedback. And I would love it if you would just, spend a couple of minutes, write a little review, give us some feedback from your heart. Tell us what you got out of this program. And if you can bring yourself to do an authentic, true to yourself 5-star review, that would be awesome. Those always help. And finally, I would just like to remind you all of the Life Mastery mantra, which I encourage people to use every single day. It goes like this: I gratefully forgive the imperfect being I have been in the past. I gratefully accept the magnificent being I am right now. I gratefully welcome the evolved being I am becoming in each new moment. Until we meet again, my name is David McLeod. I am your Life Mastery Coach, wishing you love, light, and blessings on your continuing journey. Bye-bye for now. See you next time.